now I have great honour in welcoming Mary Kostakidis.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting us. And many thanks to Bob for initiating this forum on this momentous case at the centre of which is an Australian. So, for the first time in history, the US is prosecuting a publisher under the Espionage Act, where there's no public interest defence, so no defence as a journalist. And the prosecution argues, as Greg said, that as a foreigner he has no constitutional protection, so no First Amendment either, therefore no free speech protection at all. Also, as Greg pointed out, the US is applying a domestic law internationally. It's also criminalising journalism. This is both a threat to our sovereignty and a threat to freedom of the press and democracy. They're able to pick Julian out because he's been so successfully vilified and discredited that we have come to see him as someone who deserves to be punished. So, you know, it just rolls off the tongue, our Prime Minister's tongue, he should go and face the music. He, after all, didn't he help Manning hack into classified material? He published unredacted files, including names, caused harm, deaths, damage, jumped bail to avoid rape charges, published damaging material on Hillary to get Trump elected. He's an irresponsible narcissist with smelly socks. These things have been interminably repeated in the media, irrespective of the discoverable and published facts, such as no evidence of harm or any deaths. Ecuador, in fact, concluded that his safety and liberty were at risk. That's why they gave him asylum for his publishing work. I don't have time in 10 minutes, obviously, to tell you all that I would love to tell you that I know about WikiLeaks and about Julian, about his motivations, but also about him personally. However, I will say that I've spent time with him on 3 occasions. On one occasion, I spent 3 days at the Ecuadorian embassy, and I can vouch that his socks don't smell. They started being smelly, apparently, when this colonial with a backpack waltzed into the offices of The Guardian without a PPE from Oxford or Cambridge, and thought he was going to have control of this material. The socks started smelling worse, of course, when there were the rape allegations that kept popping up. Remember, the original prosecutor, the senior prosecutor, Eva Finn, disclosed the case. There's no rape case to answer. The women didn't want to accuse him of rape. One refused to sign the statement that the police had concocted. And then finally, in 2016, publishing damaging material about Hillary, passed on by the Russians, apparently, in order to get Trump elected. Then his socks well and truly stank. I'd like to talk now about what's happened over the last 2 days, because momentous things have occurred. You wouldn't necessarily know it reading the press. On day 1 of the hearing, the prosecution argued that the charges had nothing to do with journalism and other media. They concerned WikiLeaks alone because they published names that caused harm to these people and deaths. Therefore, what he's saying is, the prosecution is saying, is don't believe your eyes if they're connected to a brain and you have read the indictment. Unfortunately, the judge, because she was trying to establish, I understand, whether there was dual criminality involved, so a crime in the US and a crime in the UK, asked a question, and the question was whether merely obtaining and publishing would constitute an offence under this law. At which point the prosecution was totally flummoxed, tried to buy time, looked in his bag, but then eventually had to say yes. Hello, bingo, media, world's media. How much more plainly does it have to be said. This is about you too. It's about journalism. Someone gives you a document, you publish it. Espionage. That should have been the headline in every newspaper, every news bulletin, because that's what's going to affect freedom of the press and democracy. The second astonishing thing that happened, but I shouldn't be surprised because I've worked in the media and I understand the mentality, is that at the end of day one, the media were handed a summary of the points argued, unsuccessfully I might say, by the prosecution, little crib sheet, little press release, and that's what they reported. So, did they report what actually happened? No, they summarised the prosecution's press release. I have to say the day started in a rather depressing way for me because I was on Twitter and saw a fairly senior journalist tweeting, who's here, who's written about stories about Assange, tweeting to a colleague in the UK waiting to go into court, sigh, take in a book for the boring bits. So perhaps that explains the attitude, the mentality, and why we have the coverage that we do in the media. On day two, we learned from the defence that the hacking charge is a complete red herring because, in fact, the military use IP addresses to track access, not passwords. But it's served its purpose because we all think he's a hacker. We all think he helped Manning hack into, to obtain documents that she didn't have access to. Manning's conscience compelled her to blow the whistle. That's the second thing that was reinforced on the second day. She keeps making that point. She's not ever going to say anything different. That's why she's in jail. They don't have evidence that he helped her in any way. They don't have the evidence. They don't have evidence that he coerced her, really. They need her to say it, and she's not. So she's just going to sit in jail and go bankrupt because there's a daily fine that's accumulating. The third matter raised by the defence was that the Guardian journalists were responsible for the unredacted encrypted file that included names being downloaded and published by other websites because they published the password in a book. Now this relates to the Iraq war logs, not the very first release, the Afghan files, the Iraq war logs, the second release. And I read David Lay's response today in The Guardian. His response went something along the lines of, but that was supposed to be a temporary password. Oh dear, running out of time. You pick up the phone and check. You don't publish the password, sorry. There's much more to be revealed here, as has been disclosed by Mark Davis, who was in the bunker with The Guardian and the New York Times about the first 2010 releases, the Afghan war logs. Who was cavalier, in fact? Who was responsible for redacting and who actually did the redacting? Who arranged the material in a form that would be meaningful to the public for WikiLeaks to upload? That's going to be a surprise. And who published first? Surprise, surprise, it wasn't WikiLeaks. It was the New York Times and The Guardian. Technical problems prevented the publication, WikiLeaks publication, by 5 days. Overnight, after day one, Julian was stripped naked twice, handcuffed 11 times and moved to 5 different holding cells. This humiliating treatment is what leads to prisoners' suicide. We know that, and the people doing it know it. I tried unsuccessfully to speak to the Foreign Minister last year about the abuses of Julian's human rights and legal rights and his fragile health. And I had my opportunity, though, when we found ourselves on the tarmac waiting for luggage after my return from Belmarsh. I told her that he may die on her watch and will want to know what she had done to prevent it, and that he's likely to die and we won't know whether he took his own life or was killed. He's been deprived of his liberty, sunshine, health care, privacy for the first 6 years in the embassy, living with the anxiety of knowing that a grand jury had been impanelled, and the only people that believed him were the Ecuadorians, had been impanelled since 2010. The extraordinary surveillance operation by the British, this high-tech van parked on the other side of the wall, so every time you wanted to have a conversation with him, you had to whisper and there was music playing. And then the hellish last 18 months when his place of refuge turned into a hostile prison, limited visitors, no internet, no phone, forgetting meals, forgetting toilet paper disappearing, knowing that they were going to give him up to the US and what would happen to him. And that's before he knew about the CIA spying on privileged client-lawyer discussions. He has great strength of character to have survived through the 10 years of this, and to endure the sustained vilification by senior public figures and the media. What I didn't expect is what happened overnight. If the British are prepared to mistreat him like this during a pre-trial, what will they do to him in the US? Julian knows exactly what to expect, and mistreat is a euphemism. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture said that in the 20 years of work with victims of war violence and political persecution, I've never seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonise and abuse a single individual for such a long time with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of law. He also said, after 2 doctors who travelled with him examined Julian, that he displayed signs of psychological torture and neurological damage. He was depressed and at risk of killing himself. The Julian I met was a young, idealistic, highly principled, highly intelligent man. Who believed journalism should strengthen the hand of those who seek justice, expose abuses of power, not be the mouthpiece of the powerful. He has published an invaluable public archive of source material that will be useful for generations of scholars, journalists, the public, and has spawned hundreds of thousands of media articles around the world, PhDs, academic books. He has received over 24 journalism awards for this. For the same reason, he's being tortured and is likely to die. And if we allow this to happen, we have lost touch with our humanity, and justice in the UK will prove itself to be completely bankrupt.